Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me introduce Dr. Zeta Theodoropoulou Polychroniadis, our chairperson. Zeta?
Good evening and welcome to the Greek Archaeological Committee's 62nd lecture and its 35th anniversary since it was founded by the late Mati Egon. My name is Zeta Theodoropoulou and I'm the chair of the committee and your host for this evening. Because of the continued problems which the pandemic is causing, our committee decided to offer once again this evening's lecture online. Let me please first mention some protocols about this evening's session. Other than panelists, all cameras and microphones will be off by default. You can use the chat button to send messages to the panel or to our speakers. The event will be recorded and uploaded on GACUK's YouTube channel. Our audience may wonder why this evening's subject is not an archaeological one. Well, this year, Greece celebrates the bicentennial anniversary of the start of the Greek War of Independence, which, as you shall hear, led to the creation of the modern Greek state. The committee, by organizing this evening's event, pays tribute to this anniversary, which marks the first liberal national movement to succeed in the old world of Europe and the consequent rise of the new nation states throughout Europe. Another departure from the norm this evening is that in addition to the presentation by our main speaker, Professor Thanos Veremis, we will bring on a second speaker, Professor Kevin Featherstone, for the two to hold a fireside chat on the topic and delve into it in more detail. Before I introduce our speakers, allow me to say a few words about the aims and work of our committee. A British registered charity, the Greek Archaeological Committee UK, was founded in London 35 years ago by the late Mati Egon. It is the only such institution outside Greece which, through lectures and scholarships, promotes Greek archaeology, forging closer links between British and Greek academia. It is 32 years since our first public lecture in London. Since then, the committee has offered 2 lectures annually, presenting the latest archaeological discoveries in Greece and Cyprus. Most importantly, it is 28 years since we have been able to pursue our core mission, to grant scholarships for postgraduate studies in archaeology at leading UK universities to Greek and Greek Cypriot students. 70 scholars have benefited to date. This year, we are supporting 6 bright scholars. The scholarships are made possible thanks to donations generously made by the Mati Egon family, the A.G. Levendis Foundation, the Maria Tsakos Foundation, the J.F. Kostopoulos Foundation, and other donors, but also through the annual subscriptions of our devoted members. As we safeguard GACUK's legacy, we hope you will join us in our mission by either becoming a member of our charity or by making a one-time donation, which will go to our scholarship fund. Every donation makes a difference. And now back to our evening's event. I would like to present to you our speakers, Dr. Thanos Veremis, Professor Emeritus at the University of Athens, a founding member of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, called ELIAMEP, and its director and later president for many years, who is an internationally acclaimed academic in political history. He held visiting positions in Princeton, Harvard, and St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and between 2000 and 2003, he was Constantine Karamanlis Professor at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's an expert in the Greek War of Independence, as well as a prolific writer. His most recent books in English are entitled The Modern Balkans, A Concise Guide to History and Politics, and The Rise and the Fall of the Nation State. Dr. Kevin Featherstone, an academic deeply read in contemporary Greek affairs, is Eleftherios Venizelos Professor of Contemporary Greek Studies and Professor of European Studies at the London School of Economics, and a very inspiring director at the Hellenic Observatory, well known as the premier international location for the study, teaching, and research of contemporary Greek politics, economy, and society. Among other achievements, I would like to mention that very recently in 2021, he was bestowed the award of Great Commander of the Order of the Phoenix of the Hellenic Republic. So let us call upon our speakers, and I call upon Professor Veremis. Professor Veremis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeta. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Good, great, great. I would like to remind us of Mati Egon. I knew her well. She was a wonderful lady, a kind we shall never see in our lifetime or even in the next lifetime, as Mark Antony said about, Mark Antony, yes, about Brutus. We shall never see his like again. So we shall never see the likes of Mati Egon again. She was the product of a certain education of a certain time. She was a wonderful lady, I must say, and I miss her dearly. Now, the subject of tonight is the centennial. We have 200 years since the War of Independence. There was once upon a time a prolific time of writing about the War of Independence, and then there was a period of silence. And fortunately, the centennial has brought back the publications of 1821, so we are much wiser now with a new look about the War of Independence. It's not what it used to be. It's not an enumeration of heroes, of great deeds, of clashes with the opposite side or between the Greeks. Now it's more about society, about numbers, about people, about organizations. So I would like to start by saying that the Greek War of Independence, the society of Greeks during the Greek War of Independence, in the beginning was not really what the War of Independence ended up with. I should make a distinction between a pre-modern society which began the Greek War of Independence, in other words, a very segmented community of people with extreme familism. The family was the major source of comfort and security, and rightly so, it became the element that really made most of the decisions during the war. And of course, extreme local segmentation. One was born in a village of such and such and died in that same village. There was very little mobility, in other words, and this lack of mobility also made it very difficult for the Greeks of the War of Independence to know each other. The idea of a social community, of a nation state, so to speak, is what we ended up with. The nation state during the Kapodicitus era, especially because I think he was responsible for providing both leadership for the War of Independence, which it lacked before. We had various people who came and went, but not one acclaimed leader. With Kapodicitus in 1827, with the National Assembly of Trizina, there was a decision to bring this great man who was very well versed in politics and make him the leader of the cause. So between 1821 and 1827-28, when Kapodicitus actually came, there's a period of, as I said, segmentation, a period of infighting. After the first 2 years of success during the war, there comes a period of civil wars, a period of problems between the Greeks themselves. But in a strange way, this also provided for knowledge of what the Greeks were about. In other words, people from central Greece, Rumeli, they called it then, had no idea of who the southern Greeks of the Peloponnese were. Not to mention Mani, which was in the far corner of the south. So people really did not know each other. What identity did they support? Their identity was mainly religious. They were Greek Orthodox people, Orthodox mostly, and Greek-speaking. Why Greek-speaking? Because the Gospels were written in Greek, or at least 3 of the 4, and the Bible, the Palea Diatheke, was translated by 70 Hellenized Jews of Alexandria before Christ into Greek. So the Greek church, in fact, had its own bibliography, lived off these great Gospels and texts, and anyone who was a true Christian should at least understand what the church uttered in Greek. And this is really what kept us with the language. We owe the knowledge and the use of the language to this tradition. But I should also want to mention that, in fact, these people of between 1821 and 1830, if you like, if we say 1830 is the end, or 1831 with the assassination of that good man Kapodicitus, people of that time, of that era, were multilingual. Kolokotronis himself, who was one of the foremost elements, leaders of the outbreak of the war, was a person who spoke certainly 3 languages very well. In other words, Greek, Arvanitika, Albanian, old Albanian of the time, and Turkish. And of course, he spoke some English, which he had learned in Zakynthos and Zante. So he was multilingual, all right. Now, since there are other members of the future Greek nation state, such as the Vlachs, I should remind you that Rigos Ferreira was a Vlach from Thessaly. He was a person of education, a person with visions of the future, of freedom for the Greeks, a wonderful individual, very inspired man. But most of the Enlightenment people, if not all, almost all, were Vlachs in their ethnic, let's say, origin. So the Vlachs is another element that enters the Greek tradition. The Vlachs were Latin speakers, but Greek speakers as well. As I said, the rule of the time was multilingual individuals, people who spoke many languages, unlike today, because today our schooling is all in Greek, some English perhaps, French in the past, but not too much. In those days, there was no schooling, but everyday life required a multilingual capability. So here we are with a society which was very different than what we know today, or 10 years later for that matter, because within 10 years, this segmented, family-ridden and based on local communities, society turns slowly into a much larger society of the nation state. This is what makes Greece by 1828, 29, 30 a modern society as opposed to a pre-modern society. Now, between those 2 dates, between 1821 and 1827, when the National Assembly of Trizina decides to bring in Kapodicitus, to summon Kapodicitus, to beg him to take up the position of the president of Greece. Kybernitis is a term which they used then, a very interesting term, but today Kybernitis is a governor. It doesn't really explain what Kapodicitus did. Kapodicitus was something between a prime minister and a president of a republic, since the head of state was yet to be found. So we should probably call him president in English. A man of great talent, of many languages. Here we have, you see now, Rigos Ferreira, that great individual of the Balkans, who foresaw the Greek War of Independence and independence itself. He died as the first martyr of that, maybe not the first, but one of the first martyrs of the War of Independence. He was caught by the Austrian police and given to the Turks of Belgrade, and he was strangled. But his works remained and still remain. They inspire a certain population of, I should call them radical Democrats of today. He was a true child of the French Revolution, but also appealed to a traditional society of his day. He was not like Adamantios Korais, who was entirely, here's the statue of Adamantios Korais by Ioannis Kossos, outside the Propylea, outside the University of Athens. Korais was an entirely different person. He was an intellectual. He was a member of a well-to-do family of Chios, began his studies, or his work rather, in Amsterdam as a member of the family business, but soon found out that he did not want to become a businessman, went to France, studied medicine and philosophy, and settled in Paris later on as one of the foremost guides of the intellectual development of the Greek War of Independence. Remember that our name, the Hellenes, or Greki, mind you, many people don't know that the term Grekos is also a Greek term. Grekos was a member of the Greek mythology, as was Elinas. For some reason, Elinas stuck. The Greeks decided to take up Elinas instead of Grekos. Korais used both terms, but he started off with Igreki. It, of course, is closer to the Greeks that the Europeans would use to define the Greeks, Grekus. So to go back to our discussion about society between 1821 and 1827, there are two national assemblies that precede the National Assembly of Trizina. One was in Epidavros, Epidaurus, actually not in Epidavros itself, but in a small place near Epidavros, which was all constructed by that Phanariot intellectual, Alexandros Mavrokordatos. Andrikos Mavrokordatos was the last of the, not the last, but one of the few who survived the Phanariot movement and tradition. He fled Turkey, he went to the West, he became friends with many people of the times, well-known names, and in Pisa, he also created a circle of his own with a important clergyman, Ungrovlachias, gosh, what was his first name? It will come to me. An important clergyman who was also an intellectual. So he does settle in Greece, but without a local following or the following of the clients that most other people had in those days, but creates his own clients in Messaloniki. And through Messaloniki, he begins to enter his own politics, not always to a good effect, but he certainly is responsible for the first constitution of the Greek War of Independence in 1821 in Epidavros, 1821-22 when it finishes. And this first constitution is very much a copy of the French constitution of 1793. It is fairly advanced and very interesting. But let's see Alexandros Ypsilantis crossing the Pruth, the river Pruth, the beginning of the War of Independence, which precedes the War of Independence in the Peloponnese. The War of Independence in Greece or in the Peloponnese begins in 1821, but 25th of March, 1821, Ypsilantis crosses the Pruth and begins the revolution in what is Romania today. In those days, it was Moldavia and Wallachia, the two elements of what was Romania in those days. A third element, Transylvania, will enter much, much later during World War I. And here is Theodoros Kolokotronis, the foremost hero of the beginning of the War of Independence, with his British helmet. He served in a unit of Greeks mainly, but other Balkan peoples as well, under British command, and brought some of his knowledge of handling a regular army back to the War of Independence when he returned as the leader of the Peloponnesian fighters of the war. He was very, very important as the beginning of that war. His first exploit was to the Battle of Tripoli. He took Tripoli from the Ottomans. He besieged the city and took it over. And then, of course, his greatest victory in Dervenakia, where he managed to defeat a huge army under Dramalis, the Pasha of Drama, and made his name. And here is Alexandros Mavrokordatos, again, a man of many talents, but also a person who was capable of intrigue, of creating problems between friends, an enemy of Kolokotronis, and a friend of Byron. He befriended Byron, brought Byron or helped him come cross from the Ionian Sea to Missolonghi, where Byron died. We shall have a chance to speak about Byron because there are other pictures in this gallery. To go back, therefore, to 1821-22, to the first National Assembly, the constitution, as I said, was very progressed, very interesting. The Greeks heard for the first time that there was such thing as the rights of man, that people were born free with the faculty of reason, and things that others in Europe had heard before. The Brits, through John Locke, 2 centuries, maybe almost 2 centuries ago, a century and a half ago, rather. The French, 100 years after the Brits, with the French Revolution, and finally the Greeks in 1821-22, when they first learn about these great achievements of the previous 2 revolutions, the American and the French Revolution. The second revolution was, in fact, the revolution. The second National Assembly was the National Assembly of what was the second assembly? Gosh, it will come to me. The second National Assembly was a kind of development of the first in terms of the constitution and in terms of the working of the assembly, how the division of powers within the assembly, which, however, this division of powers was unclear of the various faculties of the Greek government. In other words, the executive and the legislature. It was unclear as to who was on top. Therefore, the Greek Civil War was very much confused by this first and second National Assembly, not really knowing who should be ahead, who should be on top of the government, which in fact, according to the second constitution and the first, I believe, was lasted for a year. And they had to repeat elections. You can imagine in the midst of a war of independence, the Greeks had to run elections every year. And now that was very impractical, not to mention, as I said, the strange elements of description of the powers of the assembly, which, as I said, probably was in a way also responsible for the civil war that went on later. The third assembly, Trizina, which I already mentioned in 1827, was a move towards putting the constitution right. And the constitution of Trizina is certainly the best of the three. It is definitely a liberal democratic constitution and very much grounded to the needs of the War of Independence. As I said, to call Kapodicitus to take over the powers of the state was an excellent idea. Here we have Odysseas Androutsos, another great original hero of the war, a man of great talent, a man of great ability and courage, but of strange character, not too strange, a very Greek character for that matter. He would turn against his friends, against the Greeks at some point, because he was accused by Koletis of collaborating with the enemy, which indeed he did finally, out of spite for his enemies, and that made him a problem for the War of Independence towards the end. His end was very bad. He was assassinated by his closest associate, by John Gouras, thrown from the ramparts of the Acropolis, and was found dead, presumably trying to escape his imprisonment. But as we all know, he was in fact assassinated. So to go back to the Greek War of Independence, one element in the Greek War of Independence that we rarely talk about is merit. In our days, meritocracy is a constant issue, whether a government is meritocratic or given to patronage and clientelism. In those days, there was very little talk, but there was very much, in fact, done about merit, because all these first heroes, Kolokotronis, Androutsos, for that matter, Meowlis, certainly a very valuable fighter of the War of Independence, and Karaiskakis, definitely, were people of much merit. They were very, very intelligent, very resourceful, and deep down, in spite of their misdeeds, let's say, they had a sense of duty and a sense of real duty towards the country, their country, and love for their country. So all these together constitute characters that were valuable for the War of Independence. And I would say that rarely do we see such a collection of capable people in Greek history, perhaps during the Venizelos era, because Eleftherios Venizelos was capable of collecting people of talent around his banner. But during the War of Independence, these are self-made people, forces of nature or natural selection, if you like. Mind you, the terms of survival were very harsh in those days. A person should really possess talent to survive the competition from other sides of his own society. For instance, the Armatols, the Armatoli, these great fighters of the War of Independence had very little love lost between their own types. They were always competing for more ground for their armatoliki, which came from their adversary friends, so to speak. So this, again, I should repeat, is a very antagonistic society where the best man would survive and the less capable would go down the drain. This made for a rules of thumb for who would survive and who would become leader. Hence, this time is a time of merit. Many unfortunate events also happen, but that's besides the point. Very few acknowledged heroes of the War of Independence were of secondary capability. They were all very capable, very strong in intellect, not education, but strong in their decisions and the way they worked with their compatriots. Unfortunately, this segmented society, society that, as I said, slowly began to rise to the ideal of the nation state, was also capable of civil war. It was made for civil war, for that matter. And since most great uprisings in history, including the American Revolution and the French, were also plagued by civil strife, not too many people know that the American War of Independence, well, besides those we know, the heroes, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, there were others who were loyal to the throne, to the crown. And these people who were loyal to the crown did not take the revolution lightly. They opposed it, fought against it, and then fled. And fled where? They fled to Canada. Hence, Canada became the par excellence Anglophile province of America and prevailed over the French who were there before. But reason why most of Canada today is English speaking is because it acquired its population during the American War of Independence. Not to mention France and its own wars of between, let's say, the civic centers and the countryside, between Paris and whatever part of the countryside one belonged. There was a great war between the traditional values of the French, religion mainly, and the new values that came in with the French Revolution. Here we have the greatest, probably, Philhellene in the naval war of independence, of the Greek naval war of independence, the Frank Abney Hastings, a wonderful individual, a man of great courage and resourcefulness. He was the man who brought the first steamship in the War of Independence and did miracles with Carteria, as it was called, Carteria, which is a very good choice of name for such a steamship. It means to be able to withstand the adversities of the time. Here's the Venakia, which I mentioned before, depiction of the Battle at the Straits, where Kolokotronis made his mark. To go back to the War of Independence and its internecine civil wars, I don't believe we could, or the Greeks would be able to avoid such a development, because, as I said, society itself was made for a clash between allies. Perhaps the least prone to this civil war mentality were the islands. Why? Mainly because the islanders had learned, given the traits of seamen, to cooperate in order to do something in life. Fortunately, neither the Hydra people, the Hydra Arvanites, because they were really of Albanian background, and another race of Albanians in Spetses never fought against each other. They disliked each other, but they never had a civil war. And this also thanks to the leadership of that excellent Admiral Meowlis, that man who was very, very well versed into life at sea, and made his mark throughout the Greek War of Independence as none other else did, and also avoided a civil war between the sailors of the Greek War of Independence. Jean-Gabriel Eynard, a banker from Switzerland, a close friend of Kapodicitus. He helped the Greek state when the economy was in shambles. He was a man who would raise capital for Greece for the War of Independence, a great man for the cause, a Philhellene of the most substantial variety, given that economics was always the weak point of the insurgents. The economy was always faltering. They were always after a loan. Greece got 2 loans. Unfortunately, they did not serve a good cause. Much of the first loan went to manage the civil war, actually, and the second to buy a few ships, including Carteria, and then the corvette Hellas, which unfortunately Meowlis, during his last act, put on fire, because Kapodicitus had no money to give to the Hydra people for their losses during the war, and that made for a turn of mentalities, and hence here we have Meowlis, the great leader of the navy, destroying the foremost battleship, or the only battleship. Most of the others were in fact commercial vessels. Here we have the great man himself, George Gordon Byron, 6th Baron Byron by Richard Westphal. Byron was, of course, as we all know, was a man of many talents, no doubt, but also of his own character, which was not always pleasant to the Brits. Great man for Greece, the greatest public affairs success of the Greek War of Independence. To befriend, or to have Byron befriend the Greeks, was a wonderful success for the cause of independence. And many of the great poets of the time, including Goethe and others, many others, Shelley, of course, was a close friend of Byron, all came out for the freedom of the Greeks. And here is Greece on the ruins of Missolonghi, a misfortune that gave the Greeks great publicity, thanks to, among others, Eugène Delacroix, 1826, when he painted this, as he did the destruction of the island of Chios. Before that, he made both misfortunes, mishaps known to the Europeans, and great acts of sacrifice and valor. So here we have another case where a misfortune turns into the good fortune of the Greeks in the European scene of the day. Now, and here's a wonderful individual, Samuel Briglihau. Samuel Briglihau came to Greece after he finished Harvard as a medical student. He fought initially as a foot soldier, and he's dressed with the national dress of the soldiers of the Greek war. but he soon became the most important element in setting up the health system of the Greek War of Independence. He found the insurgents in an awful state of neglect. Most people died not of being shot, let's say, in a vital organ, but they died of poisoning, or what's the term, molinsis, of infections after they were shot. The Hastings, which we saw before, was shot in the hand, and he died of tetanus because there was no provision to prevent these things happening to the wounded people. Now, this great man, Samuel Briglihau, did his utmost to prevent these things from happening as much as they did before. A great friend of the Greek War of Independence, and a man who went to the United States having adopted many Greek orphans, which he distributed to friends. And here's Meowlis himself. We've already talked about him, the great warrior of the sea, the naval officer who came late in the War of Independence. He, in fact, was not one of those happy-go-lucky revolutionaries who started off immediately. It took some time before he made up his mind. As I said, he was a person of thought rather than initially than action, and then he became a man of action. A great admiral, a man without fear practically, who commanded his ships lying down because he suffered from gout and from all kinds of other problems that the sea brings to the bones of elderly people. He was an old man of 50 years old, as was Kolokotronis, also known as the old man of Morias. At 50, you were already an old man in those days. So here's Meowlis. And here's Karaiskakis. Karaiskakis, another very interesting man of the War of Independence, a person born out of wedlock. He never knew his father. He knew who he was, but he never, at least we don't know if he ever met him. He was around when Karaiskakis became well known. His mother was a nun married before, and then turned into a nun, and then had this illegitimate child. But he is really a self-made man. Here is a self-made man. An illegitimate child in days where to be illegitimate was the worst thing after death. The first thing before death, rather. It was very bad. But he managed to become the chief of the Armatolikia, of the Armatoliks of Agrafa, a well-sought prize for any Armatolos. And here's the Battle of Navarino in 1827 that made the Greek War of Independence rebound again after the destruction of the Peloponnese by Ibrahim Passas, a very capable Egyptian officer and adopted son of Muhammad Ali, then the monarch of Egypt. Here is the three powers destroying the Egyptian and Turkish fleet in Navarino, in the Bay of Navarino, and opening up the prospects of Greek independence after years of destruction, and the Greeks rebound finally and come back. So the Greek War of Independence was really a quick change between disaster and success, success and disaster. The Treaty of London here, 1827, is the beginning of Greece's independence. The Brits finally, thanks to George Canning, a prime minister, or rather a foreign minister initially and prime minister a few months before his death. He died in 1827, unfortunately. A friend of Greece in the sense that he believed that what was good for Greece was good for Britain, or what was good for Britain was good for Greece. And here is a man who did much for the Greek cause, mainly because he believed it was to the effect, served the interests of the United Kingdom of Britain. The Treaty of London was the beginning of that turn towards independence. Before that, and a bit after that, it was the Russian position that prevailed, which was an autonomy for Greece under the Ottomans, of course, with the benefit of Russian arms that would look to the fortunes of the Greeks. The British saw it in a different way. They said, make the Greeks independent and we can control them from afar as an independent state, which they did. But it's much better to have England as your patron than to have Russia of the Tsars and of that particular regime as your patron. So the Greeks, in their subsequent history, are usually under British influence. We fight two wars, especially the first war with Venizelos, an Anglophile, against a Constantine, a Germanophile, who insisted in neutrality. Neutrality was the worst of any choice, because should the British win, Greece would lose Macedonia that it had gained during the Balkan Wars to Serbia. If Germany won the war, Greece would lose Macedonia to the Bulgarians. So neutrality really had no point to be neutral. One might as well, should as well, try his hand on one or the other solution. The Greeks finally won the war along with the Allies, the Triple Entente, and the Brits become Greece's patron until 1947, when they give up this privilege and the Americans take over. To go back to the Greek War of Independence, it was really these three powers that mattered most. England, certainly, Russia, and eventually France. France had come out as the loser during the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, but thanks to Kapodicitus as well and others, they were brought back into the game of politics. Kapodicitus was a believer in France's position in the European developments, and he did help as a foreign minister of the Tsar to reintroduce the French into the alliance, into the Holy Alliance, if you like. A man of great ability, probably the most important element in terms of personalities of the Greek War of Independence. He made the final decisions and the most important decisions for Greece. Unfortunately, being against the local powers and distribution of powers to the chieftains and the primates, he suffered the penalty of death. He was assassinated by a clan of Mani. We must also say, to be on the side of truth, that the Maniots had suffered many losses during the War of Independence, and although they did support Kapodicitus's coming initially, they were friends of the idea of Kapodicitus in Greece, they later on realized that here is a very strong man who is bound to destroy their own interests, their own local aspirations by insisting in a unitary state, in fact, a unitary state, which is what France was, of course. Unitary is the opposite to what Germany is today, where states share powers. France and Greece have one center of power and a unitary state of affairs. Greece becomes a nation state Is Greece a nation in the sense of being of one people? Not necessarily. As I said before, Greece consists of Italians in the Ionian Islands, Vlachs in central and northern Greece, of Albanians in the south and in south eastern Rumeli. Athens, for instance, was all taken up by Arvanites for a long time. So we have a combination of different peoples, but there's an osmosis that goes around and brings these people together under a single identity. Now, this is something which needs a lot of explaining to do, because how on earth did all these very different people become one? And one to the point of becoming over-nationalistic on this cause. If you tell an Albanian that he's not a Greek, he will kill you, even to this day. I ventured my luck with Pangalos once, and I said, you're an Albanian. And he said, and what do you think you are? A Greek of 3,000 years ago? He was really sore when I questioned his Greekness. So to go back to a community, a society which is suddenly, slowly develops into a state, into a nation state. Perry Anderson, sorry, not Perry Anderson, his brother, what's his name? Anderson again, calls the nationalism an imagined community, a community that you can only put forth through your imagination, because it's about people you've never seen who live in other parts of the world, but speak the same language, nurture the same identity, feel that they are what you are. So this is an imagined community, a wonderful definition, I think, of nationalism, but very true to Greece, for Greece. Greece was an imagined community of people who really contributed to this imagination of theirs. And to this day, they feel what Kapodicitus felt about himself and the others. They feel Greek. Well, thank you. I think I've probably spoke more than I should. Zeta.
Thank you.
Rescue us.
Thank you, Thanos. That was very enlightening, very interesting. And I think we understood in depth the War of Independence and the society there in Greece under the Ottoman Empire. And now I would like to call upon Professor Kevin Featherstone to join you in conversation. Kevin.
Thank you, Zeta, and thank you, Thanos. It is a great pleasure to be joining Professor Veremis for this discussion. And I'm sure those watching and listening have very much appreciated his expertise and ability to bring so many different strands, so many different themes together. Let me thank the Greek Archaeological Committee of the UK for this invitation. It's, as I say, a privilege to be talking to my friend Thanos Veremis, who incidentally was one of the first Greek academics I ever met. And like many people, I owe Thanos a great intellectual debt. Thanos, I wonder if I could start the questions with perhaps an obvious one. As you say, nations need their heroes. And certainly, as you've mentioned, many of the leaders of the Greek War of Independence were incredibly able, very intelligent, not always educated, but very intelligent. And they rose to their leadership through their own efforts, largely. But it seems that I wonder the extent to which the heroic aspects have actually been romanticized in later historiography. And I appreciate that many Greek school children will have learned so much about these great men. But as you've mentioned, some of the leaders of the War of Independence loathed each other, betrayed each other, and on occasions assassinated each other. So I wonder, looking back, whether there is a risk of romanticizing the great men of history, or is it actually the kind of war which needed this individual strength and individual leadership?
Kevin, there's no doubt that people create their own heroes and embellish them and provide them with virtues that they never had, some of them. However, having said that, as I said, there is much that remains. I have a soft spot, as I said, for Kolokotronis himself, because he was a man of great capabilities and great ability, and also moments of self-seeking valor, so to speak. He was not a saint by no stretch of the imagination. Now, should we present him to our children as a saint with a helmet? That begs much discussion. I think school is not really a place where people should learn history, at least the early stages of schooling. It is a place where you learn who your famous compatriots were. And sometimes, as I said, they are presented with a little help of history. They are not necessarily what they really truly were. We are talking, as you rightly pointed out, about tough people, people who were toughened by their way of life, by competition, by cutthroat competition. We should remember that. Therefore, a person who was weak in sentiment was really in danger of losing everything. So some of them were, in fact, very commendable. For instance, I can think of Marcos Botsaris. Marcos Botsaris was really a person of ethics in the sense that he was given the leadership of the army in a scroll of paper. He kissed the scroll so that to make sure that he didn't that he cared. But he also tore it apart and said the position of the head of the army is one in battle, in the field, which is a very nice turn. Not too many would have done that. So here you are, you have people of some greatness in them. I mean, moral greatness, which comes out at certain points. So there's really a great variety of peoples in the War of Independence, which make it such an interesting subject.
Okay, and indeed, it's a very unusual kind of war. If I think of this as an outsider looking in, as you've mentioned, people of different identities. The Albanians were very important for the War of Independence.
Indeed.
Some variety of linguistic traditions. There's no single leader, no George Washington of the Greek War of Independence. And also the geography was incredibly complicated and perhaps not so clearly set at any stage at the origination of the War of Independence. In that sense, perhaps it raises a question about who was fighting and for what cause. Why were they fighting? We think, of course, as you've rightly mentioned, about the Enlightenment inspiration, the first liberal nation in the New Europe that Zeta mentioned in the introduction, that was clearly of huge influence and very, very impressive. But I wonder if you could connect for us with what was happening on the ground. You mentioned many of the Greeks fighting in different localities would not have been connected with each other in different parts of the geography, etc. So whilst the leadership, whilst the inspiration was the Enlightenment, I wonder about the motivations of those in different localities for fighting this war of independence.
Kevin, that's probably the most important question about the War of Independence. Why were these people fighting? What did they have in mind when they came out fighting? I would say that for some of them, fighting was a way of life. They were mercenaries. People like Androuchos, Kariska to a certain degree, most of the Armatoli of any worth were mercenaries. They fought for anyone who paid for their services. They fought for Ali Passas, and then they fought against Ali Passas, for the Sultan, and then finally for the Greeks. Why did they carry on fighting? I think that's the only thing they knew, practically. I mean, that brand of people. That's how they made their living. And there came a point where they said, why fight for others and not fight for ourselves? And they took their fortunes in their hands. So there was a transition between mercenary wars and War of Independence. It happened almost without people realizing that it was happening. It happened quickly sometimes with one decision, one war. When Kolokotronis fought in Valteci, the dice, let's say, were thrown. Or when the Roumeliots fought in Vasilika, that was the point where they had to make a decision, and they made it. Now, there is no doubt that Filiki Eteria and such secret societies made a point to bring all these different people together and to tell them, you know, the big words about freedom, about the nation, about religion, about anything that would make them respond. And they were successful, strangely enough. So it's a combination of factors, I think, that bring them forth. But they did not continue to do something they were not doing before. This is what I'm trying to say. These are professionals of war, at least the Roumeliotes, certainly, not the Moraites, less so, but the Roumeliotes were professionals.
And as you mentioned, as the struggle continued, there were a number of civil wars. There's also fragmentation of different local battles, regional struggles, etc. And as you mentioned in your talk, you raised the theme about segmentation or segmentary aspects to it. And I know very well that you've also written about Greece as a segmented society. You've written about the Ernest Gellner, a previous colleague at the London School of Economics, talking about a segmented society. So this is going to be a huge question, Thano, but I wonder what connects the early segmentation of the War of Independence to a later modern society, which you would describe as remaining segmentary in the Ernest Gellner sense. What's that? What's the lineage there? What's the connecting character?
Well, the concept of segmentation and the segmentary or whatever society, which is Gellner's, I think, major gift to us all as a concept, it never passed away. Even when the nation state was established, and even when the Greeks became great patriots in the national sense of the term, they nurtured their segmentary features, and they reappeared in the future on many occasions. So Greece has never really gotten over that segmentary element in its history. and in his character. I think up to the Civil War, of course, of 1946-49 was the worst reappearance of that. And in that case, it was ideological too, which is different from the pre-modern segmentation. A pre-modern segmentation is something that comes out of necessity. You rely on your own because the man next door may be an enemy, and you're never sure that he will not turn against you. It's a lack of confidence in your fellow citizen, so to speak. That is still around to a certain degree, this lack of confidence. I shouldn't have mentioned the Civil War because the Civil War is much more ideological than normal segmentation or the usual segmentation of society. That is simply our own and the others. And there's no ideology there. It's that you're my friend, you're my cubaros, you are my godfather, so I'm with you and you're with me. That's different. It's not ideological, it just happens to be the case. But there are ideological segmentations, of course, as the Civil War was, and it took us much longer to get over that.
It's interesting that you draw the parallel right through to the present day, that's the segmentary society or elements of a segmentary society still block a sense of social consensus. You'll recall, of course, that President Charles de Gaulle commented that how can someone rule a country with so many different cheeses? So you make a number of parallels to France, so perhaps that segmentation is not uniquely Greek.
No, and in fact, mind you, France is also, of course, much richer and more productive and in every sense much more powerful, but it is a society of peasants, a society of workers of the land. And they also possess some of these pre-modern features of peasant societies. So one should, in fact, there's a wonderful book, From Peasants into Frenchmen, you know, the Eugene Weber's book, which is wonderful, a wonderful book, and how the French, in fact, turn from peasants, members, segmented members of a certain community, into Frenchmen and become nationally bound by the state. It takes World War I to bring them to that state of affairs, and an international kind of universal calling to arms.
Yes. So that's a nice point, Thanos, to shift our discussion to the international aspects of it. And you quite rightly mentioned the Battle of Navarino as a key turning point. I wonder if we could come on to the point about the great powers and their intervention. It strikes me that the Battle of Navarino was an occasion where the, excuse me, the three great powers of the time, Britain, France, and Russia, kind of stumbled into the Greek War of Independence, and almost by accident, as it were. It seemed that the great powers of the time prior to the Battle of Navarino were not necessarily that supportive. I don't know whether you've seen the Mark Mazauer's new book about the War of Independence, but he comments that the great powers of the time prior to Navarino, the great powers could not have been less supportive. Their intention was to isolate a problem and to avoid it destabilizing the established international order. So for you, how crucial do you think strategic interest was for Britain, France, and Russia getting involved in the War of Independence? And how far was it led by sentiments, Philhellenism, etc.?
I would not agree with Mazauer on his statement that before the Battle of Navarino, there was little interest in what was going on here. I would remind one of George Canning. George Canning had his own agenda, and his own agenda was to forbid, to try and avoid the expansion of Russia. The expansion of Russia was always an issue in British agendas of foreign policy. They feared Russian expansion. And one way of precluding that expansion was to befriend a smaller entity such as Greece. And I think Canning also, he was a Hellenophile in the sense that he saw that the Greek War of Independence was a kind of liberal attempt to bring people out of a very backward state of affairs. So he was for it. And I'm not at all sure that he didn't whisper to the ear of Codrington before the venture, if those bloody Egyptian and Turks give you trouble, give
blast them out of the water.
Exactly, blast them out of the water. I would not preclude, I would not say that this could not have happened. I'm sure it did in a way. Mind you, there is no British politician who would love to see the East go into the West via the Peloponnese, as was the case. Mind you, Ibrahim had sold half of the female and children population of the Peloponnese to slave markets. He was financing his war by this trade. He made a lot of money, and Kapodicitus and the subsequent governments had to go through hell to find many of these people who had been sold to markets, had become Muslims. They had forgotten their language, so they had to retrain them, to establish their former kind of loyalties. And there's also very interesting, and I must say this because it's so funny in a way, when the Egyptians left the Peloponnese, many left behind their harems, and especially in Laconia. So many an Egyptian girls, good-looking probably, were in the market. What did the church do? They baptized them, and they were Christians, and they were available for marriage. And many a good Peloponnesian married the Egyptian ladies. And this is how the procreation continued, because there were very few women around. This is the problem, very few.
It's a great story, Thanos. Perhaps another aspect of the international dimension. You quite rightly refer to the loans that Greece received, the international loans that Greece received. And people like Stathis Kalivas at Oxford has argued that Greece's political developments over the last 200 years has actually benefited from a benign disposition of the great powers, that Greece has been very fortunate, and that this has been significantly caused by a foreign Philhellene sentiment. Let me play devil's advocate here and put an alternative interpretation. You quite rightly mentioned about the international loans, and in many respects they seem to have been quite draconian. The 1832 loan to Greece involved service payments that practically crippled the new Greek state. By 1843, King Otto had to impose tough austerity measures and to accept quite humiliating terms from the great powers. Later, Otto was obliged by the great powers to remove all Greek fighters, the admittedly irregulars, from the Ottoman territory to save the sick empire of the Ottomans. So I wonder, how benign would you characterize the great powers in the first decades of the new independent Greek nation? How benign do you think the great powers were? Or would you say that the terms of the loans, for example, significantly constrained the economic development of the country? It was a small, economically perhaps unviable country in many respects. So I wonder how benign the great powers actually were when we think in terms of the international loans and Greece's economic development in the middle of the 19th century.
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, they were not benign at all. I mean, I see the great powers as self-seeking, as all great powers, and small powers, for that matter, are. All powers, small or large, are for their own interest. Or this is has been usually the case, with some exceptions when they get together under the Κοινωνία των Εθνών, the First World War. There are outbursts of enthusiasm for international cooperation, let's say. And after the Second World War, the League of Nations.
Yes.
The United Nations, sorry, the League of Nations first, the United Nations later. There are outbursts of sort of idealism, but I think the rule is self-seeking powers, and this has always been the case. It's not so much that one should expect the powers to be other regarding, it's that one must make one's choice of who he would rather be with in times of war. And this is where the Greeks have been very successful. They have, on most occasions, have made the right decision. And hence, they have not lost as much as, let's say, Bulgaria has, who was always making the wrong decision. I mean, on 3 occasions made the wrong decision, went with the losers, and lost even more. So I would give some Greek leaders, such as Venizelos, for instance, the credit of making the right choice. And then later on, World War II. Let's face it, Metaxas may have been a dictator, not a very friendly dictator, but he made some correct decisions in his lifetime. One must give him credit for that. I would rather he never became a dictator and that King George had not denied the 2 big parties their plea for recognition when they finally went and saw the king and said, well, we've arranged something between the 2 of us, the liberals and the conservatives, the Laiko Koma and the others. And he says, Kiri, I'm sorry, it's too late now. Why is it too late? It wasn't too late. He didn't want to deal with the problems of democracy and made Metaxas a dictator, and that was it. I'm not saying that Metaxas was the worst of dictators. In fact, he was probably the best among other dictators.
But he made some of the right calls.
But made some right decisions. So I think one should be much more careful when looking at history itself by saying, well, you know, as many Greeks do, the foreigners were always against Greece. They were not against Greece, they were for themselves. That's different. And so it lies with the Greeks to make the right decisions rather than with the foreigners to be more benign. I think that is probably what should be said.
Thank you. I've noticed, Thanos, that very recently you've just written a blog for Eliamep in which you say that most Greek politicians today don't understand Greek history. Why not?
Well, because for one thing, they must appear to their public as completely loyal to a public view, so to speak. In other words, if any politician spoke as you and I do in this give and take, we wouldn't have a chance in hell in politics. If we came out and said the right things for the average individual, such as, you know, our nation is the best of all, it fought always on the side of good, and there were some awful powers who were against us because we were so good, so pure, so whatever, you know, that would really make a difference. It would make us very popular. Lately, I had a stint with the Greek Academy. You can't imagine how naive some of these people are, especially those who are not historians and political scientists and legal experts. The scientists, the natural scientists, it's amazing what they ask of you. They all come back and say, well, you know, you're right. I know you're a historian, you're a good historian, probably. But why do you think the church never helped the Greek War of Independence? Why do you say that the ecumenical patriarch was against the war? I said, because he anathematized Alexander Ypsilantis, for heaven's sake. It's all in a text. Ah, well, they said they did, that was a trick. That was a trick to beguile the Turks. Come on, you know. It's this naivete which rules in society when history comes up as a subject. And this is what makes the problem. I mean, you can't, you and I can discuss this forever and see eye to eye on many things, but bring another person who has no idea of what we're talking about and ask him, are the Greeks good or bad? Sure.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful, on every count.
Yes, yes.
So there's no way you can argue with that.
I must say, Thanos, your comment here resonates with me in London at the moment very, very much indeed, but that's another story.
We all have our problems.
Absolutely. As you say, the international aspects of artists and poets and writers, the Philhellenism, was crucial in shifting international opinion and to help Greece become this successful liberal nation when other struggles around Europe at the time failed. Greece endured a iterative set of struggles over a prolonged period, and Greece was successful, bolstered in part by an international Philhellene attitude. I'm tempted to ask, as of today, Thanos, do you think Greek governments can rely on Philhellenism for some of the foreign powers of influence, or have those days gone?
Kevin, I'm not sure they were ever here. The motives of many Philhellenes are very different. For instance, the Germans. You know, the Germans were the greatest in numbers that came to Greece as Philhellenes come. Why did the Germans choose to come to Greece? Because they were looking at the future of their own country, especially that diminished those small states of Germany that had no luck in history, that had gone through the 30 Years' War and counted the devastation of Germany. These people would like to see Germany united, so they came to the Greek War of Independence to see how it's done, I think. So they had their motives, self-seeking, but in a kind of noble sense, in a noble self-seeking sense. The French Philhellenes were, many of them were soldiers of Napoleon out of business, out of work. So they came to Greece to find another cause, such as the one they served before. They were looking for something. The British Philhellenes were probably the best of the kind, because mainly because of Byron, of Shelley, of people of some worth in the intellectual world that helped bring Greece into a very good light. We owe Byron that, and his friends, that they did romanticize the Greek War of Independence. So you have people like Hastings, who, you know, Hastings was a very good officer of the British Navy and got into a fight with a superior. And he had to leave office because his superior didn't like him at all. And he left the Navy, the British Navy, and went to France first looking for a job, and then finally to Greece, where he made his mark. He was excellent. He was the best Philhellene we had in terms of the war performance. So
for many, it was an escape.
And for many, it was an escape, yes. Oh, the Italians, for instance. The Italians had their own wars against the Austrians. They had lost these wars. They had been decimated on many occasions. So they came to Greece to find solace. They just thought, let's fight for them at least. If we can't do it for us, let's do it for them. So there were different people who came as Philhellenes. And of course, there was the variety of the Poniros Philhellene, the, not so self-seeking Philhellenes, which were also part of the game.
I'm going to take the liberty of asking some of the questions that have come in through the chat facility, Thanos, from people who are watching us. And this wasn't planned, but let me take this opportunity. The questions, therefore, thematically will just be quite random. There's a question, how did kapodicitus, a product of European culture, contribute to the imagined community of the Greek nation state?
Well, Kapodicitus is really a complex individual. He's not one or another thing, he's a combination of things. He is a conservative man, a conservative individual. His father was a Russophile, and so was he, and therefore joined the court of Alexander, Tsar of Russia. On the other hand, he was also, he partook in the Enlightenment. So if one must describe Kapodicitus, I say he was was for enlightened despotism. A conservative who also believed in the strong element of the state. And frankly, that was a good thing, because he came to a decimated Greece, a Greece full of local primates and local strongmen, which he disliked immensely, by the way. He disliked the primates and the armed communities. And he turned to the peasants, to the landless peasants. And one wonders how a conservative can be so friendly to the people. And my answer is that most conservatives are, because they believe that God has ordained them as mentors of the poor and of the weak. This is the idea of a true conservative of the past. Liberals, on the other hand, don't give much damn for the plight of the poor people. They say, to each his own, give freedom to society, and success will rule. So you have this different element in Kapodicitus, which you never see in Mavrokordatos, for instance. Mavrokordatos didn't give a damn about the average landless peasant. It's interesting. It was Kapodicitus who did, and was liked because of that.
Thank you. Let me, I'm going to try to take two last questions, if I may. I think our mutual friend, John Kittmer,
right.
says, thank you for a great talk. You spoke admiringly of Canning. Good, I admire him too. Then he goes on. Counterfactuals are sometimes interesting, and he poses a counterfactual. If Canning had lived many years beyond August 1827, would he, do you think, have tried to nurture a more liberal Greek settlement after 1830 than Wellington had insisted on? Instead of absolute Bavarian rule, a constitutional monarchy perhaps from 1832, or even a republic? It's a what if question about Canning.
Very interesting question. Very, very, very interesting question, because practically, if the liberals and if Canning was still in the game in 1832, I'm sure he would have preferred such a solution as opposed to a Bavarian solution, which was frankly a Russian solution. It was the Russians who were very much for summoning Otto to come over, or his father rather, and then Otto occurred. I would not overrule the Bavarians, as many do. They say, oh, the Bavarians were bad. They were not bad. The Bavarians were technocrats, and they were good administrators. They were not terribly liberal, to say the least. But this is another thing. Canning probably would have provided for a more liberal regime because it was part of his own ideology. He was a liberal and saw the world under those lenses. I think he would have made a difference as opposed to Wellington, for instance, who was a conservative, definite conservative. So a very good question, John. I would wonder myself. I think you're probably right.
Thank you. I've got some of the names here are blocked out for me, but I can see that there's a question from Spiros. Well, there are many Spiroses. But he asks perhaps a good question to finish on. Is the revised approach to the history of the Greek Revolution during the bicentenary an indication of a mature and more confident society in the 21st century, do you think?
Well, you know, each generation poses the questions that are important to itself. The originals, those who enjoyed, let's say, the 1821 events, tried to find the human elements, the heroism and the other seeking and the whatever in hence some grave mistakes committed on the way by such enlightened people as Seferis and Theotokos, who saw into Makrigiannis a saint of the Greek War of Independence. Makrigiannis was a rascal, a real true rascal of the War of Independence. He was no doubt brave, and he fought on many occasions, and he was wounded and all that. But the guy is after his own interests all the time. And he's to such a degree that you wonder how these two very wise people did not see through him. When he says to εγώ να γίνει εμείς, you know, that famous, which makes the Greeks shudder with pleasure, to εγώ να γίνει εμείς. He uttered this in the midst of the Civil War, which he fought against, as a Roumeliot, against the Peloponnesians, and burned and did all kinds of strange and awful acts because of the Civil War. And then he says, to εγώ να γίνει εμείς. God knows what he had in mind. So there you are. I mean, it takes rereading, a lot of rereading and establishing who's who in the Greek War of Independence. But I think all in all, we have some wonderful memoirs, such as Kasomoulis, for instance, the 3 volumes, which are a true piece of wisdom from an ordinary man. Kasomoulis, who fought a losing battle in Macedonia and then came down to the southern Roumeli and fought on the side of Stournaris, who was the kapetanios of Aspropotamos. Aspropotamos is Achelos, the river Achelos, and he fought with him and then entered Messolongi with his patron. And God knows why his patron, why Stournaris went to Messolongi. a rich man, a well-to-do man who went into and suffered the entire siege and then died in the Exodus because he couldn't run. He was at the overripe age of 52, I think, or 53. Again, another old man. Who could not rise, who could not run effectively. So there you are. Read Kasomoulis. Kasomoulis is wonderful, wonderful.
Anna, I could speak to you for the evening, and I always enjoy your wonderful way of connecting so many different themes. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I thank you for your what you've given to us this evening, and I'm sure it's been appreciated by everyone who's joined us. Let me pass back to our host, but with my thanks, Thanos.
And thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Back to you, Zeta. Thank you.
How do you manage not to age after all these years? That's my question to you. When I met you, God knows how many centuries ago, you looked like a young child then, and you still do. How on earth do you manage?
It's because I adjust the camera that you're watching at the moment. Back to you, Zeta.
A heartfelt thank you to both of you, to both of our speakers, and I wish we could give a big round of applause to Professor Veremis and Professor Featherstone, who contributed to this splendid event. Both speakers encouraged us to look at this turbulent period from a different perspective and broadened our understanding of the formation of the first state in 19th century Europe. They have also helped us to remember the pivotal role of Philhellenes played in the Greek cause, as well as the involvement of the European great powers during that period. Thank you so much. Now, if you wish to contact us, make a donation, or be on our emailing list, all information is on the screen now, and a copy can be found on chat, which you can download. Help us to help young, promising archaeologists to fulfill their dreams and give them opportunities for a better future. Thank you all for attending this evening.